Should kids be left to their own devices? This is a more important question to answer now than ever before. I'm Clifford Sussman. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I specialize in internet and video game addiction. We're in a global pandemic now, and parents are being faced with hardships they could never have imagined. I can at least try to help with one of them. We're all confined to our homes together with our children. How do we manage their screen time? How much is too much? How do we as parents set age-appropriate limits? I will talk about why, no matter how tough it gets from the lack of structure. Parents should really try hard to maintain a balance between on-screen and off-screen activities. This is a parent survival guide to the COVID-19 screen time crisis. If you want more on the topic of screen addiction, you can go to my website at www.cliffordsussmanmd.com, and you can go click on the link that says Internet and Video Game Addiction Information. I'm going to talk to all parents, not just the parents who are pretty sure they have kids who are addicted to screens. Why should you be listening to me about this? Well, I am a child psychiatrist. I've been in private practice in Chevy Chase, DC for 12 years. And my specialty is internet and video game addiction. I'm actually a gamer myself. I have a background in programming and developing games and educational software before I went to medical school. I do frequent public speaking on this topic, and I've written many articles. I've had several media appearances. I've been featured in the New York Times and ABC News and Time Magazine for Kids, HBO Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. I'm also currently an expert consultant at Karen Renaissance. They have an internet and video game use disorder track in Boca Raton, Florida. Before we get into my main focus, which is screen time, let me say a brief word about something I know a lot of you are worried about, which is how are kids affected by screen content in a pandemic? Our kids are getting exposed to a lot of very confusing and emotionally challenging screen content. When kids feel a situation's not under control, they tend to take on a lot of burden that they don't need to. They may have exaggerated beliefs, for example, that somehow decisions they make might have caused what's happening or could prevent what's happening. Now, children will feel even more unsafe if they see their parents panicking. Some kids may act out or become angry as a defense, and that can oddly restore them to a sense of control. Don't be surprised if you see this reaction in many grown-ups as well. As parents, you're realizing right now that many hours of unstructured time puts our kids in a situation where they're playing video games, they're watching social media, they're using other forms of screen-based entertainment, many hours on end. I'm going to refer to that as digital binging. Is this a problem? If they have nothing else to do, who cares? It's keeping them occupied and out of trouble, right? That might be true if it weren't for the fact that digital binging has a residual effect on our children's brains and ultimately their behavior. Let's say this is your kid. On a regular day, this is what's happening with dopamine. It's going from the presynaptic neuron, which means the brain cell before the synapse, to the postsynaptic neuron, which is the brain cell after the synapse. And in order for the signal to continue, the dopamine molecules, represented by these Pikachus, have to go from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, and they actually go to receptors on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron. And when they go into those receptors, that's when the signal continues. We get the greatest dopamine flow when we're getting instant gratification, when we're not having to wait for stimulation. So let's say this is your child and he's bored because he's stuck at home during this pandemic, and he sits down to play video games and they start to stimulate his brain right away, right? So instead of doing this, it's doing this. There's lots of dopamine going into the synapse, into the postsynaptic dopamine receptors, and your child is feeling pleasure, right? He's feeling stimulated. And so this is what's happening when he's gaming. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Don't we want our kids to feel pleasure? Well, there really isn't anything wrong with it. The problem comes when you're doing this for a really long time, let's say hours or even days. It turns out that the brain can't sustain this, and that if you're just constantly getting bombarded with dopamine, you eventually develop a tolerance to it. You become desensitized to the effects of dopamine. And this actually happens because the number of receptors on the postsynaptic neuron goes down. That's a process called downregulation. This is what tolerance looks like. There's fewer receptors on the postsynaptic neuron now. So even though your child is still playing video games and he still has plenty of dopamine, there's not as many receptors. Therefore, he's desensitized to pleasure. So if you look at his face now, instead of playing to feel good, he's just playing not to feel bad. But what happens if you come into the room and you say, look, you've been playing Fortnite now for 12 hours in a row. It's really time to stop and go to bed. And you take your kid off the screen, and all of a sudden the source of dopamine stops. So now he's still got fewer dopamine receptors, and it actually takes a while to get them back. But he no longer has the source of dopamine. So what happens is he feels even less pleasure, less stimulation than he did before he started. This is often referred to as withdrawal, and you can tell he's not enjoying life very much. Kids in this state can become pretty irritable, aggressive, angry. Another thing that happens when kids are in this state is they're more likely to seek reward. Unfortunately, this condition can last for quite a while. It can last into the next day, maybe even several days, maybe even more than a week. So what that means is that digital binging does, in fact, lead to more boredom. And then when kids are more bored, what do? They have more reward seeking. And when they're seeking more rewards, what happens then? Digital binging. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. It just keeps getting worse and worse, and your kids just get more and more bored. So now you can educate your children on how excessive screen time, particularly when doing instantly and continually stimulating activities, can worsen the boredom that draws them to screens in the first place. And that way it can make a difficult time even worse. A lot of families traditionally look at their kids' activities, dividing them into homework versus play. I would like parents to look at their kids' activities in a way that's more like the way the brain sees it. It's not just work versus play, but actually high dopamine activity, which is again activity that's instantly and continuously gratifying, versus low dopamine activity, which doesn't necessarily have to be productive or homework. It could just be any activity that has some delayed gratification. So for parents, the goal should not just be to get your kids working more and playing less. It should be for your kids to balance high dopamine and low dopamine activity. Healthy use of screens is balancing the two. So I like to call activities that are instantly and constantly stimulating high dopamine activities, or HDA. These are the activities that cause a high flow of dopamine and downregulation of postsynaptic dopamine receptors. These activities can be on-screen or off-screen. On-screen activities that I consider high dopamine would be video games, social media, web surfing. Off-screen activities would include drugs, alcohol, and gambling. And then there's low dopamine activities, or what I call LDA, activities that require more delayed gratification. On-screen activities can be LDA, like using a word processor or using apps like PowerPoint or Photoshop or doing programming. Off-screen activities, exercise, homework, of course, but things like board games and tabletop games, reading. For it to be a low dopamine activity, it just has to have a delay in gratification. That doesn't mean it isn't pleasurable or rewarding. There's many steps in playing a board game where you have to wait for a reward. There's delay in gratification. Even if it's just a matter of minutes, it's still minutes more than you would get from, say, a video game or a YouTube video. Now you can have the family sit down together and make a list of as many low dopamine home activities as they can come up with. Perhaps the more the kids come up with these activities themselves, the more control they'll feel of the process, but it's still a good idea to write them down, and you can give that list to the kids as sort of a menu when they're wondering what they should be doing in their low dopamine time. So, what can parents do to make sure their kids are maintaining balance between low dopamine activities and high dopamine activities? It's really important to have routine, structure, and a daily schedule. You can even have the kids come up with a schedule themselves, post it on the wall or on the refrigerator, but just make sure they follow it and that they're still taking care of things like hygiene and self care. They're showering every day, they're brushing their teeth every day. All of these things will give kids a sense that life goes on and that things really are still in control, just like we talked about earlier. Pay attention to mealtime. Have your kids put down their screens, turn off the TV yourselves, and the family should come together during mealtime. This is a good time to work on those precious face to face social interactions that they're no longer getting at school and that they're no longer getting with social distancing. Nighttime habits are also important. Make sure that kids are having some period of time before they go to bed where they're not using screens so that they're really getting ready to sleep and not being stimulated. So perhaps an hour before bed, maybe they charge their phones in a room where they're not sleeping. Maybe there's no screens at all in the room they're sleeping in. It's a really good idea if you can to separate in your home the area for doing low dopamine activities from the area for doing high dopamine activities. Give kids a room to do their homework or online classes in that's not filled with screens that are going to distract them. And if they have to do their work online, have them use a screen that perhaps they're not using to play their video games. Maybe you can give them separate machines. Maybe they can be doing their online classes in a room with minimal distractions. You can even remove the apps from the desktop of the computer they're using that might distract them. Kids are going to learn more from what you do than what you say. So as parents, you want to model balanced screen behaviors. And realize, especially if you have younger kids, that the habits they learn early on will stick with them for the rest of their life. So if you have really young kids, make sure that you're teaching them healthy technology habits. Make sure that you're setting limits with them. They're making apps for babies now. They're making YouTube videos that even 4, 5, and 6-year-olds would love to binge. So it's really important to start kids at a really early age with setting screen limits. And a lot of parents have experienced power struggles with their kids when they tell them to get off a screen at the end of a screen use block. One thing that actually will help with this is having very consistent blocks of time for their kids to be on screens so that they develop what I call a commuter instinct. What's a commuter instinct? It's like when you're on a train and you fall asleep, but you always wake up in time for your stop because you take the same train every day and it always takes the same amount of time. So if you have a consistent block of time that's reserved for screens, perhaps an age appropriate block, maybe for a younger child it's 30 minutes, maybe for an older child it's an hour. I certainly wouldn't make it more than an hour. If they're going to play a game like massive multiplayer like Fortnite, they may plan it so they just do one round at the start of the hour and they spend the rest of their time on YouTube videos so that you don't have that big battle when the hour is up of, oh, just 5 minutes more, I'm in the middle of the game. I don't want to disappoint the friends I'm playing with. But even more importantly, once the block that you designated for high dopamine activity is over, make sure they wait at least that long. If it was an hour block, make them wait an hour before they're allowed to use high dopamine activities again. Now, you may say, what if kids are alternating high dopamine activity and low dopamine activity throughout the day, so they're actually getting a lot of total hours of high dopamine activity? I wouldn't worry about that so much because they're also getting a lot of practice with delayed gratification. Every time they have to wait to get back on, they're training themselves to tolerate delayed gratification, which is also a really important skill. If it's met with a lot of resistance at first, or if your kids have problems with excessive screen use to begin with, you may want to consider starting out with a dopamine detox. That's when you remove all high dopamine activities for a longer period of time before you even allow them to start alternating between LDA and HDA. It could be a day, it could be a week. At rehab programs, they do it for a month. The longer you do it, the more dopamine receptors you get back. And a lot of parents will say that if they keep their kid off of high dopamine activities for, let's say, 3 or 4 days, they'll see completely different children. They'll see different personalities. And they'll say to me, "Oh my gosh, like you pretty much cured my kid. They're acting great now. Can we just keep the screens away? Can we just keep them from all high dopamine activity?" And well, you know the answer to that, especially now. It's pretty nearly impossible and not really practical or realistic. So it's important to remember that if you just let kids go back to their old habits after a dopamine detox, whatever success you got from it, you're going to undo. So it's really important to go back to a balance after the dopamine detox is complete. Now, remember that kids, teenagers, especially heavy gamers or screen users, they're much more motivated by short-term consequences than by long-term consequences. So meet your kids where they are. Forget about contracts or the total hours of screen time per day or week. Just have a clearly stated house rule that each block must be followed by at least that much time doing a low dopamine activity or a screen-free activity. Agree beforehand on an immediate and logical consequence if this is violated. That could be adding another hour to the off-screen block or to the low dopamine activity block. Now expect kids to receive that consequence. Don't feel like a failure if they can't abide by this at first, because that's how they learn. And in turn, you learn to parent better when you learn to carry out those consequences. So again, no need for contracts. They're just going to get kids to feel like if they violate it, they failed and they might as well use all the screens they want. So don't punish non-screen related behavior with less screen time. Like parents who say to their kids, if you don't get a good grade in school, we're going to take away your phone. That's just useless and it's not a logical consequence. And don't reward good behavior with extra screen time either. The goal should be a consistent, healthy balance. So you're sending the wrong message. One thing you're going to hear your kids say a lot during this pandemic is, "There's nothing to do. I'm bored." You can have a room filled with low dopamine activities. Here's a picture of one I have in my office. It's my screen-free entertainment room, and it's filled with lots of puzzles and games and activities and crafts. You can put books in yours. You can have kids spend time in this room either by themselves or as a family during their low dopamine activity blocks. And if they're still bored, remember that being bored sometimes is good for them. It makes them feel more stimulated when they're not bored, and it often generates creativity. As a parent, you're trying to keep a balance yourself, just like you want your kids to have a balance between low dopamine and high dopamine activities. As a parent, you want to have a balance between allowing your kids to learn to self-regulate, but also having limit setting and natural consequences. For older kids, you want to encourage a little bit more independence and self-regulation. And for younger kids, you may need to do more limit setting. When parents go to the extreme, there's problems. Like if parents allow their kids to completely do what they want and are too permissive, it becomes enabling of screen problems. And if they go to the other extreme where they're just policing their kids on screens all the time, it's micromanaging. And it doesn't really work, because eventually your kids are going to have to be independent and on their own. If they're too dependent on you to regulate them, they won't be able to self-regulate. So as parents, look to find that balance. Now, what happens if you try all these interventions and they're not working because your kid's screen use during this crisis is just becoming more and more dysfunctional? And you start to ask yourself, are my kids addicted? Is their problem way beyond something that I can help them with? The World Health Organization does have an official diagnosis called gaming disorder, which they limit to just games. But when I'm treating people, they're having problems with all sorts of screen use, not just gaming. You can pause this if you want to read the criteria, or you can go to their website. Essentially, what it means is that there's dysfunction in their life that's related to their inability to control their screen use. So what are the red flags for parents to look for that this may be going on and that they may need to call on an expert like myself? Well, look for seeking behaviors. That could include aggression. It could include lying about screen use. It can include stealing money from parents to upgrade games or pay for loot boxes. It can include children making suicidal threats when you try to set limits on their game time. So those are some of the red flags to look out for. If you're like me and you're stuck inside all the time during this pandemic, you're going to start appreciating all the little things that you may not have appreciated before. Well, the same will go for screen time in your kids if you can teach them to have a balance. The more they have a balance, the more they're going to enjoy the screen time that they do have. Like I was saying before, you can get more psychoeducation on this topic on my website at www.cliffordsussmanmd.com. You can click on the link that says Internet and Video Game Addiction Information, and it'll have resources like this article in Bethesda Magazine on how the tension over screen time is pitting parents against their kids. Please help other parents. Click the like button and share this video.